Thank you all for being here, and thank you for those kind words, Bob. It's always humbling to hear other people speak of different things that I've tried to accomplish. So happy Earth Day to everybody. I know it's tomorrow, but we're here today and we're celebrating today, so we'll celebrate in advance. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. So it would be probably much easier for me to stand up here and spend all my time and probably into the evening hours saying about how destructive humanity is on the planet and all the bad things that we've done. And the list, unfortunately, is more than a mile long at this point, and it keeps going. But that's not what Earth Day is about. Earth Day is about hope for humanity as much as it is for the planet, that we can try to learn about what we're doing and correct some of these things. And fortunately, we're doing a good job. There's a lot more work to be done, as always, but we're finally heading in the right direction. And Earth Day is a celebration of that. It's optimism and hope and the good things that we're doing. It's interesting, even though we're discussing native plants here today, the Earth Day theme for this year is reduction of plastic waste. So I felt like I at least had to mention that, even though we'll be discussing native plants with the optimistic goal of reducing 60% by 2040. So we can all start working on that sooner than later. So we're going to focus on some of these constructive things that we can do with native plants and talk about the resiliency of the earth and the planet, and especially native plants, and how important in particular these native plants are really to the whole ecology of the area. And more importantly, with native plants, what we can do to nurture the ones that we're blessed to already have growing here in Maine. I always consider ourselves to be fortunate that we're still more or less immersed in native plants. Most of the time, all we have to do is look at the edges of our properties or our backyards or any place we visit, and amongst the invasives that are growing there, we still have plenty of natives, and that there is hope there. By the way, if I start going off on a pessimistic tangent, throw something at me, I won't take offense to it. So, no, just kidding. So it would be good to talk about what native plants are to begin with. And I've always just assumed that folks knew what native plants are. And of course, we all kind of have our definitions of them and things that we've been told and learned and such. But specifically, when we speak of native plants, those are the plants that were growing here at the very least before colonization back in the 14 to 1500s and for eons and eons before. They're the foundations of the ecological communities that we have here. No matter where you look, whether you're looking at critters that fly or crawl in the soil or somewhere in between, we don't have to look back too far to see that there's a connection there to native plants, which kind of makes that whole process work. Being the foundations of these ecological communities, supporting all the animals and other plants for that matter from the ground up, they're primary producers, going back to this concept that we probably had learned about way back in our early days of education. The fact that they're able, something we take for granted, that they can take those photons from the sun, that energy that's traveled millions of miles through the cosmos, they can take that and through this miraculous conversion with photosynthesis, make something of that, almost like making something of nothing in some respects. And from that, we see the green that's all around us and the foundations of our ecosystems. But in order for this chain of life to work, it's really important that native plants are at the base of this. Insects that feed on these plants, in turn, feed innumerable other organisms up and down the food chain. And when we speak of native plants, perhaps the most important part of it is the thought in the term of coevolution. The fact that these plants have been here, co-evolving, mingling, working with other elements of the ecosystem for millions of years. And it's that point that's perhaps the most crucial. Doug Tallamy often reminds us of that in his influential teachings and works and the several books that he's published. And he's very masterful at making this connection between plants, insects, and birds. And that's just a great context that we can all kind of take home and something that most of us can relate to. And at that point, we can, by having that to relate to, it's tangible. It's something that we can feel. It's something that we can see every time we step out of doors. So this coevolution has allowed plants and insects to be in this constant arms race of sorts, this dance, if you will, of the plants kind of evolving these mechanisms to prevent herbivory. Let's face it, who wants to be eaten? So plants have developed largely chemical means of discouraging insects from eating them. And in turn, insects have been co-evolving with this and coming up with their own clever solutions, whether they're physical solutions or chemical solutions, certain chemicals in their body that allow them to break down these very complex plant chemicals that we tend to find and allow them to eat that. And in turn, they're converting those primary producers into energy that the rest of the ecosystem can use. And we often find ourselves disassociated with nature. I take time every day just to go out and even look at things that I've looked at seemingly a million times before, but just to kind of feel that connection. And there's actually a term for that. It's known as biophilia. By many folks, it has been E.O. Wilson, the preeminent ecologist of our time. He's spoken quite a bit about this, but it's basically this genetically rooted need for humans to be around other living things, whether they be the plants and the animals and the communities that make up a forest, walking through a field, simply being around other people. It seems to be a part of us, and it makes us better people. Clinically, it's been shown to reduce anxiety and stress, and let's just face it, make us happier people. So who can argue with that? We could all use a little bit more happiness in our lives. So going back to the plants and the insects part of it, so these insects will feed thousands of animals that have in turn been feeding on the plants. And these insects, whether we want to admit it or not, are the main reason, or one of the main reasons, why birds will migrate thousands of miles every year coming up from their southern homes that they spend the winter to eat these insects that are here because of the plants. So we can see this kind of triangle of life forming, and that's an extraordinarily simplified view of it. But it's something that's tangible and something that we can all relate to by simply looking out our windows and seeing what's going on or taking a stroll through our gardens. So I said I wouldn't be too pessimistic. But of course, so without these connections that we just discussed, we're just starting to hear so much of the bird song in the mornings now, just as the sun's starting to rise, just before and into the early morning hours. Without that, we'd be kind of looking at that silent spring scenario again that Rachel Carson had warned us about seemingly so long ago. But this time it's kind of taking a different turn. Without the basic food source. It's not so much about poisoning anymore, as Rachel Carson had mentioned, but now it's simply about food. So there's a reason why all those birds are here and not going anywhere else. So after saying all this, we know that the fact that we're all here today is significant to me, that we can't wait for help. We can't sit around hoping that maybe somebody at the federal level will come around and start these programs up at the state level, even at the town level. No, we have to go a little deeper than that. We have to go to the grassroots level. Excellent organizations like the Planeteers, Wild Seed Project, myself, we've all been working extraordinarily hard for the last couple decades to get this message out. And it's finally out, it's being recognized, and it's being acknowledged, and perhaps most importantly, it's being implemented. Just the fact that we're here today says an awful lot. Not to go off on too much of a subject here, but for democracy, for all its liberating benefits and the ideals that we hold dear, moves at a glacial pace at times. Too slow, way, way too slow. So there's no need for us to sit around and wait for somebody else to take action. We can take it now. We can take it when we go home after this. There's no need to wait around. So we now have this critical mass going that's been building up over the years. And it's rolling, and it's bigger than just a snowball coming down over the hill. It's turned into something the size of this building, which is just incredible, because when I started this 20 years ago, it was extraordinarily discouraging. I couldn't seem to find anybody who really wanted to support my mission. Obviously, there's always speaking with people in the choir, if you will, folks who are interested, but now it's so nice to see these broader audiences, and that circle gets larger and larger every year. The wonderful events that we have in Kennebunk with the Planeteers sponsors in the winter have just been getting better and better. And it's wonderful to see new faces coming in as we discuss these important concepts. So here we're talking about all this, and we wouldn't be human if we didn't ask, well, what's in it for us? So that's kind of an easy thing to answer. We often talk about these so-called ecological services, things that we take for granted. We turn on the tap, we have clean water that comes out. Oftentimes, one of the ways that we decided to try to make these ideas more acceptable to the public is that we monetize them. Now, there's a bit of implied sarcasm there, but you know, it's another tool to try to get folks to understand. We can tie dollar amounts to the pollinator services that our insects and our non-native insects supply for us in the tune of billions of dollars each year. If they weren't around to help out, we probably wouldn't have the bounty of crops that we expect to see every day when we go in the grocery store. Everything from almonds to pumpkins to blueberries, the list goes on and on. Again, worth billions of dollars. Native plants can feed us too, which seems kind of odd because we've spent so much time domesticating plants and bending that genome and the genetics to our will, but the native indigenous populations have known this for thousands of years, and that's what's fed them, and that can continue to feed us. Things that we probably have all indulged in at one point, high bush and low bush blueberries. Some folks are surprised to realize that those are native to Maine, but they indeed are, and in fact, a lot of these plants that we have growing in Maine, their genetics have been used to make so-called improved varieties for commercial production of a lot of these produce and such that we take for granted. Blueberries, strawberries, cranberries. Again, the list goes on and on. The other thing that native plants are really adept at doing is absorbing chemicals from the air and the water. Some plants are better at it than others. And there's been some focus now at trying to look at some of those plants. Instead of planting these non-native plants that look pretty and not terribly functional, let's start planting native oaks, for instance, that are exceptional at absorbing pollution-causing chemicals from the air, such as ozone and various smog and such. And so that can help us out there. Our intact wetlands help filter water, and again, eventually they'll provide us with clean water sources as it makes their way, that little drop of water makes its way down through the environment. So we really do have a lot of things to be grateful for, and of course a lot of work that needs to be done. So what are some of these things that you and I can do, and some of the things that we can, perhaps most importantly, teach other folks to do? We can start by planting native. And albeit it's a little bit of a learning curve, and I always found a great deal of irony in this, is that we have all these plants growing around us, but we know nothing about them, relatively speaking. So instead, we're grabbing for plants that are supplied for us in garden centers and other places of business, and they're non-native. They're usually treated with chemicals to look really superficially pretty and pompous for us, and they're really not doing a heck of a lot. So you ask maybe like, okay, if just you or I do this, is that going to make much of an impact? So it's the cumulative effect, the additive effect of us all doing something. If we all went home, and even half of us did something, and then we taught other folks about what they're doing, and they did. So it starts to go across the wave, the landscape rather, like a green wave, one that's actually helping out instead of simply taking from the world. Eventually, when enough people have these individual plantings in their yards, we're essentially forming kind of informal wildlife corridors. For so long, we've been at battle with invertebrates and insects, and now we're welcoming them, and we want to see insects eating our plants. That's a sign that the system is working, that intact ecology is still functional at this point. So. And the other thing that we can all do is do our part to try to make native plants easier to come by, which has kind of been my passion. When I started about 20 years ago, you could buy native plants, but they're often cut off from the public. It was mostly a commercial basis for lofty goals like wetland restorations and other commercial purposes such as that. So we have a lot of programs already in place that probably most of us know about. No Mow May is coming up quickly, and that's a great time to lay off the lawnmower and you don't have to let your whole lawn go unmowed. Just try a little section. See what comes up. Yes, there will be invasives that pop up and non-native plants, but more often than not, you'll have a whole group of native plants that will come up that have been waiting there for a long time waiting for that opportunity for the guillotining effect of that lawnmower blade to stop. That's all they need. I often say, you know, we can do an awful lot by simply doing nothing sometimes. And that kind of illustrates that concept. After the discussion here, we will have a slideshow that's already started here into effect. So that will kind of show a lot of these concepts that we're talking about. So the air will be cleaner, the less we mow, lawnmowers and weed whackers and such release an almost unbelievable amount of smog and pollution compared to vehicles. So not only are we having native plants, we're having cleaner air. So just a few small actions can have almost like an inordinately large impact. So of course people are going to ask questions. Why are you lazy? Why aren't you mowing your lawn? Don't you know this is what you have to do? The Joneses across the street are doing it. This is probably the best part of this whole situation, is that it elicits discussion and thought. And you can be the centerpiece of, in some ways, of your community. But the thing that we need to be extraordinarily careful of is not to criticize or shame. Look at that big lawn that you have over there. You could have a huge field of native plants being so much more ecologically beneficial than what you have there. We don't want to do that because that turns people away. We want to be constructive criticism. Not everybody's going to be on board. Sometimes it takes people longer to be on board. Some people will never be on board. And that's okay. At least we're talking about it. We're having the conversations about it. And that's the important thing. You may have heard of another program of sorts of simply leave the leaves. Why would we want to do that? I see the amount of effort that's put into removing leaves this time of year as we're getting ready for summer and spring, and then also, of course, in the fall when we have piles upon piles of leaves. And just the simple act of leaving the leaves has tremendous benefits. Again, we don't have to leave the whole lawn covered in leaves. Just pick an area that edge off to the side of the yard. Maybe in the backyard, where, just to see how it goes. Nature is the ultimate recycler. Those leaves are performing that vital function of restoring all those nutrients and all that effort that was taken to pull that out of the ground, transform it into leaves with some energy from the sun, and then release it back. And the tree's planning to recycle those nutrients. And the organisms, the microinvertebrates and the other microorganisms that are in the soil are depending on those nutrients to come back. And most of the time they're not. And that in turn affects everything above ground. That health of the soil is critical to nearly everything, the more that we see and talk about it. So, and it's a lot easier on your back too. I mean, who really wants to be out there raking leaves until the short evenings come around in the fall? So that's another benefit there, selfishly considering ourselves, of course. So, and perhaps the last thing that we need to talk about before we go on to the slideshow here is to reconsider what a weed is. So there's a lot to a name. When we think of milkweed, what are we supposed to think, right? It's a weed. Well, milkweed, fortunately, is a poster child for those critical larval host plant interactions. And of course, we know the monarch butterflies, they need to lay their eggs on that, and it's the larvae that when they're hatching, they'll start to eat those leaves, and that's how they complete their life cycle. So without this weed, we're knocking out this whole stage of a life cycle for an organism. That's just not very fair, in my opinion. So other critical native plants like fireweed, it's not its fault that it's particularly good at coming in these early successional areas that have been burned or traumatized in some way, and you go from bare, perhaps burnt ground. The next year, it's a field of pink. That's some weed, huh? So, and there's countless others. Joe Pye weed is another example, a wonderful native plant that just has so many ecological services that it provides to, not only is it aesthetically pleasing, but also is critical to other organisms as well. And one last quick little note is just lay off the chemicals. I know a lot of us have done tremendous work at doing that, but things that we take for granted, whether they're pesticides, herbicides, or even fertilizers. In some cases, fertilizers can be almost as poisonous in their own way because we use so much of them. Some of the statistics that I read that I won't bore us with here because they're depressing, the millions of pounds that are over applied and the millions of gallons of hydrocarbons and oil that it takes to produce these, it's just, it makes your head spin. I don't want to get into that today. I want to leave on a good note in the fact that we are making progress in all these things. I'll quickly go through our slideshow here. Chris will be our maestro when it comes to progressing from one slide to the next. So we're all pretty familiar with the monarch butterfly and its plight, and the fact that planting native plants like this wonderful New England aster will support them in their adult stages and bring in a variety of other migratory butterflies as well. Next slide. We often think of monarchs as being almost the solitary species of migratory butterfly, but painted in American ladies are migratory as well. Perhaps they don't have the epic journey that monarchs do, but they'll often visit our yards in the fall. Maybe there'll be a cluster of 4 or 5 of them, and maybe they're there until the next hour, maybe they're there until the next day. Next slide. These large, showy flowers like purple coneflower are wonderful at attracting these big, showy fritillary butterflies that kind of come in, and it's interesting to see them competing for landing spots and feeding spots on the flowers. Next slide. This was particularly interesting. Again, this is a weed. It's called rose or swamp milkweed. But last year was a particularly wonderful season for these crescent butterflies. And at any one time during the day, there are 6 to 8 or maybe even 10 of these fighting for the feeding rights on these flowers. Can't forget our woody plants as well. When we're often talking about pollinator gardens and planting for pollinators, whether we know it or not, we're automatically deferring to these so-called herbaceous perennials, basically flowers in our flower garden. But our woody plants are critically important as well. This one here is buttonbush, which we typically see growing in wetlands. Here we have beach plum, which attracts a massive number, almost, I hate to use the term swarms because it has a negative connotation to it, but just massive numbers of insect pollinators that will come in when these flower in May. And this is just about a little snapshot showing, we have 2 different orders of insects here. We have the beetles off to the right and the bumblebees there in the center. Next slide. The hummingbird or the clearwing mosses are also known, just fascinating creatures with these really long proboscis, or these tongues that they can hover and feed at the same time, which is just striking to see. And, the reason why we have those where we do, yes, it's because the adult is coming in and feeding on the plant and taking care of its nutritional needs at that point. But it's because we have our native viburnums in the area too, which is this so-called larval host plant, which the immature form of this organism is going to feed on. So that's another thing to really keep in mind. They're here for a reason, and sometimes we have to dig for those reasons, and they may not always be apparent. Poke weed, as it's called. I like to call it pokeberry because it slices off that weed suffix. It has a more pleasant connotation to it, but a wonderful feeding plant for bluebirds. This one's outside my window, and we can watch the bluebirds come in and out till nearly every berry is gone off from it. So, kind of a good example of the power of the oak tree being a keystone species, feeding hundreds and hundreds of different species of insect larvae. There would have been a time where if we had seen this skeletizing action on the leaves, we would have seen this as a bad thing. We might have even wanted to spray for it. Now we see this as precious evidence that the system is intact and is working, and we should be grateful to see insect feeding on our trees at this point. Next slide. So Maine has always had a wonderful and innovative agricultural sector, and that still shines through today. We may not be the big producers like we used to, but we're moving into other crops now, including growing native plants. Seed-grown, local genotype, local provenance are arguably the most important aspects here. This happens to be at my nursery here in Alfred, but thankfully there's not dozens, but perhaps approaching dozens of us small, almost micro growers now who are working to get these native plants onto the market. It's silly. We don't need to be importing from Michigan or from Connecticut or from places to the south or to the west of us. We're perfectly capable of growing a very fine product ourselves. So as we kind of go into the last section here of the slideshow, this is the result of No Mow May. So this is a glorious, seemingly infinitely stretching stand of goldenrod at Lodholm Farm in Wells. And the number of organisms that this must support is just probably hard to calculate or even fathom. Next slide. Same place at Lodholm Farm, but kind of a different field. This is little bluestem grass. Grows in these really kind of poor soils that are often sandy, very low in nutrients, but it's thriving. I use this as a great example of, it's a wind-pollinated plant. So why would it have any importance to pollinators? The fact that it's a larval host plant for up to 9, 10, even more different species of butterflies. Who would have thought? How can a wind-pollinated plant be important to butterflies? But the lower we dig into this and look into the soil, the more that we're finding. Next slide. Here's another great example, just down the road here at the preserve on, I think it's on Route 99. Just a huge field of milkweed. And milkweed supports an awful lot of other really interesting insects other than just the monarch. Just taking a few moments to watch the interactions between it and the other insects. Wonderful things like metallic beetles that almost seem artificial to look at them. So again, just the act of not mowing is supremely powerful. Next slide. Another example, this one in Sanford, showing the power of not mowing. I mean, look how beautiful this is here, and the amount of life that must support. It's aesthetically pleasing. Why would we want to have this tightly groomed lawn in its place? Next slide. And here's another no-mow area, this one down in Elliott, where just this relatively small strip along the edge of an athletic field. We have Joe Pye here growing in the background. We have our goldenrod, and in the left side of it we have an invasive plant, purple loosestrife, which is kind of wreaks havoc on wetlands, but in other respects it also does a lot to feed pollinators in an area that there's really nothing else around in some cases, just barren athletic fields. So not justifying invasives, especially this one, but just saying we just need to think outside the box here, and that's a great example of it. Next slide. All these plants that we're mowing down when we're cutting our lawns, bluets are one example. Their happy little faces are going to be coming out soon. Next slide. Things like violets and wild strawberries that we're mowing down and not even knowing. Next slide. And this is out in front of my house. This is my no-mow area that I've been cultivating over the years. And it's a mix of largely native plants, but there's also some non-native plants. There's some phloxes there on the side. They're not invasive. They support an awful lot amount of wildlife, so I make sure that there's room for them in there. And my wife has threatened me if I took them out, so that's another good reason. Next slide. Even clovers. Clovers are not native, most of them, but the amount of services that they provide to the environment is tremendous. They have nitrogen-fixing nodules and bacteria on their roots, so they're leaving the soil a better place than what they found it in. Wonderful pollinator plants is a constant activity, especially in the early spring when these are out. So, plus you have these, you don't necessarily have to be committed to mowing your lawn all the time. Next slide. And this is our last slide. This is up at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens in Booth Bay, and this is kind of what could have been very easily a lawn, grassy hillside, but we have this instead, and it kind of speaks for itself. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.